In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Want to be a winner?
You've won £18,000.
Oh, flipping heck. I don't know what to say.
Enter our massive spring giveaway with 3 big seasonal prizes to be won. There's £12,345 in tax-free cash to give your finances a spring boost. We'll also send you on a shopping spree with £500 worth of vouchers to spend in the store of your choice. You'll also get a garden gadget package. For another chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News,
Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Good evening, good people. How lovely to see you all again. Welcome to the Neil Oliver Show on GB News TV, online and on the radio box. This evening, my show will be looking at the effects of the lockdowns. We'll be discussing whether what happened in 2020 and thereafter is still having an impact today. My first guest will be Dr. Claire Craig, and we'll be talking together about how bringing the country to a standstill had and still is having an effect on children and young people. I'll be joined after that by former lawyer Molly Kingsley, who in 2020 was one of the founder members of the group Us for Them, which stood up for children's interests during the pandemic. And then former leader of the National Education Union, Kevin Courtney, will talk with me about why schools had no choice but to shut their doors when they did. All of that, plus plenty of discussion with my panellist, political commentator and friend, Ralph Schulhammer. But first, an update on the latest news.
Good evening to you. It's a minute past 6 here in the GB newsroom. I'm Aaron Armstrong. At least 74 people have been arrested in Russia on the final day of an election Vladimir Putin is guaranteed to win. Thousands of people staged a symbolic Noon Against Putin protest, forming long queues at polling stations across the country in an apparent show of dissent. Allies of the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny, including his wife Yulia, called on voters to spoil their ballots, vote for any other candidate or write in Navalny's name. She led a demonstration outside the Russian embassy in Berlin, with similar scenes outside Russia's embassy in London. It is the third day of an election in which no genuine opposition figures have been allowed to stand. Transport Secretary Mark Harper says Rishi Sunak will lead the Tories into the next election. Senior Conservatives have been attempting to downplay claims of a plot to replace the Prime Minister with Penny Mordaunt. It would mean a fourth leader of the party in just 5 years. And Mr Harper says, unlike Labour, the Conservatives have a plan on delivering for the country.
We've got to show them, by the time of the election, two things. We've got to show them that we've got a plan, the plan is working and it's delivering for them. And I think we can see that it is on inflation and on taxes. We've also then got to show them that the Labour Party doesn't have a plan and will be a big risk. You know, for example, we know the Labour Party wants to spend £28 billion on their green plan. They've hidden the price tag now, but they don't know how to pay for it. That would mean taxes going up.
Drivers have been dealing with more disruption on the third day of the M25 closure amid reports of 3-mile-long tailbacks. A 5-mile stretch between junctions 10 and 11 in Surrey has been closed since Friday night, so a bridge could be demolished. National Highways say the works are on track and they've confirmed the planned gantry has been installed overnight. Motorists, though, recorded tailbacks yesterday, although we understand everything's on schedule for the road to reopen for 6 a.m. on Monday morning. And revellers are gathering in cities around the world to celebrate St Patrick's Day. In Belfast, thousands of people have turned out in the city centre to enjoy the parade there. Dancers, green flags, all the usual paraphernalia. No shortage of music and colour in Dublin either, where locals, usually armed with a bag that clinks, usually vie with tourists along O'Connell Street to watch the annual parade. It's said to be the largest ever this year, but no one celebrates being Irish quite like the Americans. And Chicago gearing up for their traditional parades with the city's river dyed green as always. You can get more on all of our latest stories by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's time to Neil.
We tell ourselves that children are our most precious resource and treasure. We sing songs about it. I believe that children are our future and all that jazz. Let's have a look at the recent reality of life and death of children around the world, shall we? According to the Gaza Health Ministry, more than 12,300 children have been killed in that open-air prison since October last year. The children of the generation that went through the fires of hell and said never again are witnessing 21st century children consumed by other flames. Plausible genocide, the International Court of Justice calls it. If taken at face value, it would mean more children died in Gaza between October last year and February this year than the combined number of all that died in all conflict around the world in the 4 years from 2019 to 2022. For those who dismiss numbers presented by the Gaza Health Ministry as unreliable, even fictional, the Save the Children charity estimates the total of dead children in Gaza in the 100 days from October to the end of January, that's already 6 weeks out of date, at 10,000. Whichever figures you believe, it seems reasonable to accept we're confronted by a lot of dead children and babies piling up in the few square miles of Gaza. There's all manner of footage, again, much of it roundly dismissed as fake in some way, of little corpses pulled from piles of rubble and wrapped in brightly coloured blankets for transport to God knows where. Maybe God does know. Hopefully God cares as well, because evidently not enough of the right people do. Not enough to make it stop. Children are our future, we sing. So what about all those children with no futures at all? Last month, UNICEF estimated at least 17,000 Gazan children had been orphaned by that war, or at least separated from all family and therefore left alone. 17,000 stories of heartbreak and grief. In a separate report for UNICEF, the plight of the children of Ukraine was laid bare. 2 years of chaos, destruction and loss, separation from families, disrupted schooling, disrupted healthcare, reports of a mental health crisis and a learning crisis. Many children have fled the chaos alone, exposing them to abuse of every kind. Human trafficking on an industrial scale, children robbed of childhood, scars visible and invisible. Human traffickers, child traffickers, dark tales abound of more of the same, harvesting a bumper crop of orphans in Gaza too. It seems to me that present evidence makes plain that far from irreplaceable treasures, too many children are treated as disposable. Closer to home, we have altogether different damage to contemplate. All parents hear and share anecdotal evidence of harms caused to children during the COVID years. In lockdown, the response to the neighbourly question, "How are you all doing?" was met first with a cheery, "Fine." Time spent digging deeper, however, invariably revealed struggles, anxieties, real concerns about youngsters. We must now conclude that as a society, we will be dealing with the poisonous consequences of lockdown for years to come, if not forever. A consensus on the number of so-called ghost children, those who fell off the radar of schools and social services during the COVID debacle and haven't been heard of since, is hard to come by. But tens of thousands is certain, and the think tank Centre for Social Justice says 100,000. The CSJ tries to keep a spotlight on the poorest and most disadvantaged in society, and as early as 2021 they were warning, quote, "COVID-19 has wreaked havoc in our schools. Young people's life chances have been laid waste by successive school shutdowns and interruptions to their learning. The damage caused by lockdowns could not be clearer than in the case of school attendance. The pandemic has given rise to a generation of ghost children. If we're not careful, we're creating an Oliver Twist generation of children exposed to significant safeguarding hazards." End quote. Over the years here at GB News, I've spoken specifically about children. My primary motivation for speaking out at all in any context from the beginning 3 or 4 years ago was as a parent, fearing for my own children, what lockdown and the rest of the madness would do to them, how it would affect their futures by fundamentally altering the fabric of society. When it came to the products pushed as vaccines, my number one focus was on making sure no needle touched any of my children. And so, from time to time on a Saturday night, I made children the focus of what I was talking about, including asking questions about harms caused to so many by the malignancy of the lockdown policies that kept families apart, closed schools, delayed learning to speak, compromised normal emotional and psychological development, delayed the learning of social skills, left unknowable numbers isolated in dangerous domestic circumstances. But the truth is that the viewing figures for those monologues were always conspicuously lower than those on other subjects. Maybe when it comes to children, too many people just don't want to know, just don't want to think about it. But here we are in 2024 and a world made different. All parents know that if their children were hooked on phones and the rest of the tech before lockdown, that time of enforced isolation only cranked up the addiction. We all hear the stories about spikes in the number of children self-harming, with eating disorders, simply struggling with day-to-day life. Referrals for children needing mental health treatment spiked along with the rest. Last year it was reported that 1 in 5 primary and secondary age children are behind in their speech skills, their understanding of words. Charity Speech and Language UK said it was the highest number of children with speech and language challenges ever recorded. 80% of teachers said children in their classrooms were lagging behind. This is fundamental, condemning generations to underachievement, to isolation from society on account of not understanding, not being able to make themselves understood. During a recent parliamentary debate on excess deaths, Conservative MP Dr Caroline Johnson, a consultant paediatrician as well as an MP, reported that up to March 2023 there was an 8% increase in child deaths compared to the year before. She went on to say suicide and self-harm was the main cause of death for children between the ages of 10 and 17, quote, getting much worse in the 10 to 14 age group. Stop for a moment to take that in. Of course, the vast majority of MPs won't discuss excess deaths, full stop, staying away in droves from any debates on the subject. Which brings me to the subject of accountability. We can see where we are now, surrounded by children struggling, falling behind, falling through cracks in the floorboards, dying in greater numbers than before, self-harming, killing themselves. All of this has happened on our watch in a time made utterly different by official policies, with which MPs of all stripes remained in lockstep, almost without exception, giving their full-throated support. Safe and effective, that worst of all mantras, was a death sentence for uncounted numbers. Worst of all, it was never based on data of any sort, just baseless, preordained propaganda from the start. Save our NHS, 3 weeks to flatten the curve, no jab, no job, were yet more mantras, all of them contributing to the alternative reality in which we find ourselves, with children bearing so much of the brunt. Last week, the sometime catch-up czar, tasked back in 2020 with helping repair the damage done to education, talked about the circumstances that saw him resign his post and walk away in disgust, describing how government at first promised commitment and then refused to foot the bill for the necessary measures. Sir Kevin Collins said, "All these things we could have done to send a signal about childhood, but we did nothing. We gave up. It was pathetic." We must have accountability from MPs, from doctors, from scientists, from the media, from all levels of the establishment. Because if those who set and train the policies that left us where we are remain in post, then we will have learned nothing, and even worse consequences will lie ahead. All the time children were shut up at home, all the time we were told children are resilient. It was Wine Time Friday in Downing Street, a maskless free-for-all where access to the data plainly reassured those ruling our lives, restricting our lives, that there was nothing at all to fear. We know where we are. Hardly any child can report a peer that died of COVID. Plenty more have seen youngsters, often the fittest of the fit youngsters, dropping dead on the field of play for reasons that are never made plain, never discussed. Like so many of us, they've certainly known family members, neighbours, parents of friends succumbing to unexpected heart attacks and strokes, more of those who feature in the spiking figures of the excess deaths we're not supposed to notice, far less mention. A generation of our youngest, at crucial times in their education, know they were let down by teachers, by university lecturers, let down by the authorities that closed their schools and their gyms and the rest of the venues making up the fabric of their lives, that they were pressured into accepting medical interventions even when they'd had COVID and so had natural immunity from an illness that posed them no meaningful threat anyway, so they could get into pubs and nightclubs. They look on at the adults, those who wielded power over them, and find no reason to trust those so-called grown-ups ever again. It's no exaggeration whatever to say that on the altar of Save Granny, children's well-being was knowingly sacrificed, and many of them know it. I remember saying at the time that a society standing behind a shield made of its own children, that forces children to risk their lives by being injected with products that were demonstrably neither safe nor effective, and that most important of all, they never needed, is no society at all. Here's the thing. Society sought to put children's lives on hold, to shut them indoors, to sacrifice their education, to turn a blind eye to the hobbling of the natural development of the very youngest and most vulnerable. I ask again, where are we as a society? Who are we as a species if we don't put children first at all times? As parents, our gut reaction should be to nurture and care. So why do we so often look the other way while so much is inflicted on the innocent by those guilty of putting profit and ideology before the well-being of our youngest? I'm joined now by political commentator Ralph Schulhammer. Thanks for joining me, Ralph.
Thanks for having me, Neil. Always a great pleasure to be with you.
And for me. Ralph, I am in reflective mood this evening, looking back over the long period of 3-4 years now. Can I invite you to, how do you assess what happened and where we are now?
Well, I think there are a couple of things we know now. I mean, we have known even before COVID that particularly for people of an elderly age, loneliness is a major cause of death. And now we know that also for young people, loneliness has significant repercussions. I think you mentioned absolutely correctly, right? Whether it's the use of social media, whether it's screen time. But I think that's more a symptom than a cause, right? If you have no other meaningful connections, the likelihood of you being addicted to social media is significantly higher. And I kind of looked up a little bit the development of civil associations in Britain over the last 100 years. And it's in steep, steep decline. So I think the social media age is just showing us something that was going on beneath the surface for a longer time. And what happened during COVID, and you mentioned it's wonderful in your monologue, what made it so frustrating is apparently there was this sincere belief that children don't need social contact, right? That you particularly at the most important stages of development, 15, 16, puberty, right? The first love, like the first beer in the pub with your friends, like this was taken away from that generation. That is, as some would say, this is not just a crime, this is a mistake, because as you correctly pointed out, you stunt the healthy social development of these young people. And if you look, for those of your viewers who are not that often on social media, but there is also this wave of violence among young people, and especially girls, right? You see like all these videos of young girls beating each other up, and kind of the young guy standing next to it, filming it on their phones, but not intervening. That is, again, this is a sign of kind of a social decline, of a moral decline. What I think that a lot of what we saw in recent months and recent years were just the symptoms. And the other thing, and I'm sure we'll have more time to talk about, is what bothered me the most in the whole COVID thing. If the government would have said, this is a new situation, we are not entirely sure what we're doing, there will be mistakes, but we invite you, we want you to, let's do this together. But as you said in your monologue, right, what they ultimately did is that they made rules for others that they themselves broke. And
let's pick this up. So much more to be discussed. After the break, I'll be joined by consultant pathologist Dr. Claire Craig to talk about the effects of the pandemic lockdowns, what they did to children and young people. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go anywhere.
Mark Dolan Tonight. Weekends from 9 p.m.
I've personally been very torn on whether Prince Harry should have full police protection when he's in the United Kingdom. On the one hand, why should taxpayers fork out for somebody that's left the country and the institution? He is no longer a working, serving royal. But I don't think it matters. He is one of the most famous men in the world, and whether he's a royal or not, he is an ambassador for this country. And he still does good. Charitable causes, the Invictus Games, and he is still a nice and charming guy with a heart. And whilst he has left the royal family and departed these shores, he was and remains the son of King Charles. That is a biological fact. Well, let's hope so. And it wasn't his choice to be born into royalty. It wasn't his choice to be the son of the king. And for that reason, I think he should have equal police protection to his brother William when he is in this country. He couldn't be a more high-profile figure, and unfortunately, like all the royals, Harry will be a target for some very bad people. I fear that if, God forbid, anything happened to him or his family, the authorities would have blood on their hands. So, it's not often that I back Prince Harry, but on this one, he has my support. Look what happened to his poor mum, killed in a Paris tunnel in the 1990s with an allegedly drunk chauffeur. A top royal security insider recently told me that Diana would still be with us today if she had had top royal protection at that time. So let's not make the same mistake twice. Prince Harry needs full protection and the best we've got. Yes, he might be a numpty, but he's our numpty.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
From 10 a.m. every Saturday, we want to make you think and we want to make you laugh.
So we will give you all the top stories.
Now we start with a story that has shocked the nation this week.
But we're also going to make it light and fun and bring some entertainment in to make your Saturday morning nice and restful.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back once more to the Neil Oliver Show. My first guest this evening is consultant pathologist Dr Claire Craig, who is the chair of HEART, a group of doctors who came together over shared concerns about policy and guidance recommendations relating to the COVID-19 pandemic, so-called. Claire joins me now. Thank you for being here, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
As I did earlier with Ralph, reflecting on all that's happened in the last 4 years, what is your assessment, specifically in relation to what it has collectively done to children and youngsters?
Yeah, I think that is a really core question, and it's when I think what's important to understand is that we can reflect back now and we can talk endlessly about the harms that it was caused, and a lot of people are now prepared to talk about the harms that it caused. But the reality is that we knew this beforehand. We knew even more after the first lockdown because we had evidence of it, and yet still we were pushed into more lockdowns thereafter when the harm was well and truly established.
I got and get the feeling that children were always regarded as somehow invulnerable, that in some way it wasn't going to matter what was done to children, that they uniquely would absorb everything that was thrown at them and bounce back untouched.
Oh, absolutely. And if you remember back, people kept repeating the phrase that children are resilient. The WHO were the ones that were using that phrase, but it was repeated endlessly, as if, as you say, as if they were somehow not more vulnerable, which they are, but less so. And there was research and people writing about it as if it was the children's fault if they weren't resilient. They should toughen up. Like, nobody would say that about adults who were in a situation that was unpleasant. And children aren't resilient, not all children. And the children that suffered the most are the ones that already had all sorts of, problems in terms of kind of home support or other issues, which meant that they were never going to be resilient. And this has impacted them massively.
The very idea, that repeated statement about resilience seemed to be taken as justification for, therefore, testing children to breaking point. Just because they're resilient doesn't mean you push them to the point where they can take no more.
Well, yeah, ridiculous, isn't it? And the reality is that all that phrase really means is children keep growing. They'll still turn into adults. Well, yeah, sure, they'll still turn into adults. But, whereas teachers can step away and have a year off their work trajectory and it has no consequence when they step back in, they're where they were. The same is not true for children. Every year of a child's development matters, and you can't skip them. You can't pretend they don't.
Ralph, it seemed obvious to me that, where for an 80-year-old, 1 year of lockdown was, well, an 80th of their life, a year of lockdown for a 2-year-old is half a lifetime. And so for that reason, if for no other, what was done to children ought not to have happened because of the scale of it in the context of their own existences.
Well, I think in other causes, we have created a culture that is, I would argue, inherently hostile to children. If you look at the conversation around it, children are a burden, like you can maybe afford children, but most people shouldn't. Then, of course, we have the entire Malthusian movement that says that the entire human race is a plague on the planet and every child is basically a sin. And it kind of, bleeds over into the quasi-religious. And I think that was also shown during the pandemic, that in many ways, right? And even before the pandemic, we don't really invest in the development, in the education, in the social development of our children. The Jesuits had a saying, give me the boy and I'll show you the man. But nowadays, apparently, we don't care about that at all, which I find is very, very frustrating.
Claire, what would you say? What do you say to those who make the argument that, well, for example, schools had no options, that they were just kind of handed a fait accompli, and that therefore everything that happened to children in the context of education was out of their hands somehow?
Well, I mean, there's so much wrong with that, not least the fact that the teachers' unions were integral in pushing for lockdowns politically, particularly the one in January 2021. So if you remember, the schools actually reopened for a day, and then the unions effectively called an illegal strike because they were getting their members to submit paperwork that they had written a template for to say that the working environment wasn't safe and persuading them not to attend work. And that sort of pushed the government into saying, well, let's have another lockdown. But in reality, schools provide way more than just, the transfer of knowledge. Schools are there for lots of reasons within a society, including safeguarding children, including feeding some of the children, including the social development of the children amongst their peers, but also including the relationships with their teachers. And I find it extraordinary that teaching leaders have just completely abandoned the importance of that at a time when AI is knocking on the door saying, well, we can do transfer of knowledge. We don't need just that. You need a relationship with a teacher to motivate you to want to learn. And that's what was taken away from them, among other things.
Amongst many things that trouble me is the way in which there's a whole group who are being described as the COVID kids or the COVID cohort, as though there's already some sort of admission that there's a slice of our population that are going to carry COVID around their necks like an albatross for the rest of their lives. Oh, you're one of the COVID lot.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And one of the things I found, I was a bit nervous about coming on here because I'm a data person and some of this feels a little bit more emotive. So I had a kind of testing the water, reading around it, getting other people's opinions. And one of the things that really struck me is that people are talking about the immaturity of particular cohorts, but they're talking about it and applying it to primary school children, secondary school children, sixth formers, people at university. So, that effect of missing out on a year or two of maturation has its impact throughout that whole, progress through education.
Am I right in thinking as well that the COVID inquiry, so-called, for what it's worth, wasn't even going to look at the effect on children?
That's right.
Yeah,
in their
decision.
terms of reference, they didn't include one mention of the word child or children.
I mean, what does that say to you, Ralph? That the very body tasked with considering what had happened and what might happen in the future decided, but we don't need to think about what happened to children.
No, I think it's even worse because the precise development that you describe, you talk about Great Britain, but the same is happening in Austria and Germany as well, right? They wanted to do an inquiry and now they pushed it back and back and back and back. It's probably never going to happen. Germany, the same thing. It's the issue is ignored. And I'm sure we're going to talk about this more because the government or the state simply cannot admit that they made a mistake. Right? This is what fascinates me the most. They just cannot say, I'm not even asking for an apology. I think in Denmark there was one newspaper who actually apologized. But other than that, neither the German nor the Austrian or the British government, nobody had the guts to say, we made mistakes, we are sorry. And that's a small gesture, but I think it would mean quite a lot to many people.
Absolutely, and we need to hear it from the teachers
Agreed, yes.
as well.
Yes.
Like, why aren't the teachers saying this now? They're seeing the impacts every day. And they're not saying it, they're not defending their profession.
How, not just refreshing, but I think it would be so meaningful and so impressive for the general population if figures in authority would come forward and say, we got that wrong. That's not a cause for people being shamed and driven into, outer darkness. The population would heave a sigh of relief and say, finally somebody with the backbone to take some of this on their shoulders.
Absolutely, and of course, while that's not happened, there's a constant feeling of threat that it might happen again. And that affects the children. I mean, the children are not convinced that they're out of this.
This will not happen again. Thank you, Dr. Claire Craig. Another break's upon us already, after which I'll be joined by one of the founders of the group Us For Them, Molly Kingsley, to talk from a personal point of view about how the lockdowns had an impact on her own children, as well as everyone else's. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Don't go away.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast on the Met Office. Well, for the week ahead, it is remaining changeable across the country, but for the most part, it's going to be fairly mild. So as we end this weekend, still got low pressure in charge. This weather front here will bring another spell of rain as we go through the course of the night. Ahead of it, it does turn largely dry and clear, especially across parts of England and Wales. Some mist and fog forming in a few spots. And then behind it does then turn a bit drier and clearer for the end of the night across Northern Ireland. But for all of us, it is going to be a mild night. Temperatures not falling much lower than around 5 to 7 degrees. So we do start the day off with some sunshine across eastern parts of the Midlands, East Anglia, Lincolnshire way, but the cloud further west will spread its way that a little bit further eastwards. Any rain on it will slowly peter out, so not actually a lot of rain arriving into East Anglia. And then behind it, it does turn drier and brighter, some good spells of sunshine developing before then the next band of rain arrives in the west. Mild, temperatures potentially reaching 17 degrees in the southeast. Tuesday, a rather grey and damp start, plenty of spots of rain around. As the day goes on, we will see some bright spells across parts of Northern Ireland, Scotland, maybe Northern England too, and still remaining fairly mild. Wednesday, Thursday stays fairly changeable, quite wet potentially on Wednesday, but all the time temperatures for all of us in double figures.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQs Live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQs Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. My next guest this evening, Molly Kingsley, had young children of her own during the pandemic and ended up so concerned about the impact the lockdowns, amongst other things, were having on young people, she formed the group Us For Them, which campaigned for schools to reopen. And Molly joins me now. Molly, do you have any confidence that the last 4 years have taught us anything? By which I mean, do you think if the next one happens, which we're told it will, that things will be different?
I have no confidence, and in fact, I think, OK, that might be a bit of an oversimplification. I think we have learned on school closures. So obviously, as you said, you know, where I came into this, I guess, was a campaign to get schools open. I really, really hope we will never close schools again, and I have some confidence that will be the case, at least perhaps save, you know, you can imagine a situation that is so extreme and actually where children are genuinely so threatened that it is the right thing to close schools. We've always said that is imaginable. I don't think it was the situation we found ourselves in 2020. I do have some confidence schools won't be closed again. However, I don't have any confidence that in a similar situation where you have, you know, millions of adults' health seen to be threatened, children perhaps threatened less so, I have no confidence that we wouldn't make the same decision to prioritise effectively adult health and well-being and safetyism over children. No, I don't.
Now, you actually put under my nose a piece relating to Sir Kevin Collins, who was the so-called catch-up czar, who the government tasked with repairing the damage. But he walked away from that position because the government was, as he found out to his horror, were not going to properly fund it. And there was a line that really struck me. All these things we could have done to send a signal about childhood, but we did nothing. We gave up. It was pathetic. That's strong.
I mean, it makes me so upset, actually, Neil, because he's absolutely right. Of course he is. But there were people, myself and colleagues included, Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner at the time, a handful of politicians, there were people who were screaming so loud about this for so very many years, and no one listened to us. And to hear Kevin was one of those people, I know, he did no doubt his utmost to get this recovery package pushed through. I think one of the things that Kevin talks about, which I find very powerful, and again, myself and us for them colleagues were saying at the time, is this whole language of recovery is very uncomfortable. The thought that you could close children's lives down, close their schools, take everything away from them, and somehow you'd be able to recover them. And I think, people like Liz Cole and I, one of my Us for Them co-founders, were saying right back in 2020, 2021, that we shouldn't be using this language because it gives a false sense of security that we can rectify what we're doing. And unfortunately, we kept on using that language. We kept on, I believe, being gaslit by government. We had people like Gavin Williamson telling us it would be the biggest injection of energy and cash that the country had seen since 1945 to repair the damage to schools. And in the end, that proved absolutely hollow.
So am I right in thinking that what you mean by that is that even if they had embarked upon a Marshall Plan for education and children, it was still the wrong idea, that you could inflict hurt and then fix it?
Yeah. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking of children as, beings that it is OK to harm if we can fix them afterwards. That is, any parent would take issue with that. Imagine if I said that about your children. Imagine if someone said it about mine. I would, get very angry.
What is some of the up-to-date data telling us now? I mean, you've always been across the numbers. What is it saying 3-4 years later that we can understand about the consequences?
Yeah, so look, I'm going to give you a few headline figures and then I'm going to caveat it, but let me just give you a feel first. And one of the issues here is there is so much data, it is almost hard to know where to begin. Some of the most shocking data, I think, is around what we've done to the school system. So we still have, 4 years after the original school closures, 4 years this week, pretty much, or coming up to it, we now have 1 in 10 pupils who are persistently absent from school. That is a marked increase on numbers before the pandemic. And, who knows if that will ever recover? It isn't so far. 1 in 5 children, so almost 2 million children across the country, are not meeting speech and language milestones. I think that's an incredibly grim figure. Speaks particularly to younger children, but of course that kind of deficit sticks with children through their whole lives. And I think the other, awful figure is we have 200 children a year now who are committing suicide. That's 4 school kids a week committing suicide. That's horrific. The caveat to that, however, Neil, is that a lot of these issues did exist before the pandemic. So, if you take a slightly longer view and look at the figures, certainly from 2000, perhaps even 2010, you will see that the rates of decline in children's physical and particularly mental well-being were already there. So this trajectory in some ways has got worse, but probably maybe not caused by the pandemic itself.
I mentioned this with Dr. Claire Craig as well, but this idea that the government were consistently saying that, well, we can't help this. We're in a situation of such danger, such significance that, well, the children are just going to have to take this and then we can move on. How do you respond to that feeling that, in a strange way, the buck seemed to stop at children, which seemed like the inversion of where the pyramid of responsibility ought to have been?
Absolutely inversion. I mean, it's something we talk about a lot, actually, in our first book, The Children's Inquiry, this idea that we have inverted the natural order, the natural morality of things. Adults are meant to protect children. As to the specific point, we had no choice. Of course they had a choice. It was a policy choice. And they knew, and we knew from April 2020, that COVID was a very discriminatory virus. That is the sad reality. It did not hugely impact the vast majority of children. It was never going to. It was very dangerous for some adults. I think that is now a given. We were never told that at the time, were we? And it might comfort senior policymakers to tell themselves, just as they told us at the time, there was no choice, but there was a choice. And you know what I would say, Neil? I would say that even were COVID a serious risk to children, you would have to take action through the lens of what was needed to protect the children. That may have meant closing some schools, may not have done. A way of protecting children that didn't inflict such grotesque, really, sort of pain on them. clearly that's what we should have aspired to do as a society, and that just never happened.
It just never happened, you're right. Molly is going to stay with me through the break and after, when we'll be joined by Kevin Courtney, who was the General Secretary of the National Education Union at the time of the pandemic. And he will argue, I think, why schools had no choice but to shut their doors. You're watching Neil Oliver on GB News. Don't go away.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Now, I'm sure you have seen this video that went viral this week, and if you haven't, well, I think you're going to enjoy it. This is a firefighter leaning on a fence whilst watching a trapped driving instructor's car sink in 4 feet of floodwater. Looks very comfortable there, doesn't he? Just leaning against the fence.
Just chilling, just relaxing. Yeah, there were two. There were, in fact, 2 Essex fire and rescue crews, an ambulance and a police car parked near the sinking vehicle, but they wouldn't enter the water because they had to wait for specialist crews who were trained for the water depth.
Well, 2 people who weren't going to sit back and watch were these 2, Jack and Danielle Price, who took it upon themselves to rescue the submerged driver. And Danielle joins us now. Very good morning to you, Danielle, and you are a hero, an absolute hero. What happened in this video? Make sense of it for us.
So we were filming in the area for our YouTube channel, and we've seen the fire brigade come through. I was actually out at 5 o'clock in the morning with my husband, Jamie. We know it always happens there, as you can see, and it was clear. We've seen the fire brigade come through, we've followed them, and they're just standing around as if nothing's happened. In the clip, it says he's fine, he's on his phone, and then sort of walked away. But what they failed to realise is when my partner actually opened the door, as you can hear, he's on the phone to the sort of the emergency crew in panic, thinking he's going to sink. So we could not just sit there and watch. He's absolutely terrified.
Yeah, poor bloke. Well done you. Do you reckon this is health and safety gone mad?
It is, because although I do sympathise with them, they are so red-taped, but surely sort of common sense has to kick in as open the door.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, my next guest this evening is Kevin Courtney, who was Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union at the time of the pandemic. He says schools had no choice but to close as the virus was rife and it would have been unsafe to keep them open. Kevin joins me now. Thank you for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
The teachers' unions were amongst the most strident, weren't they, in their calls for the schools to close, even when other voices said they should open. How do you look back on that now?
Well, you know, you make decisions in the light of the information you've got, the science that you understand at the time. So I look back on it and I think that we made the right calls. I do need to say the schools were never closed, completely closed, because they were always open to key worker children and vulnerable children at every period. But there were long periods of closure. It was always government that closed them, but we were advocating at some of those points for that partial closure.
Why so determined? You know, when there were, you say the science, and there were other voices, including the government, saying the schools, you know, should open generally. And yet the teachers' unions were determined otherwise.
I mean, for example, in January 2021, we were calling for schools to close. Boris Johnson on a Sunday night said the schools were open. We were saying they should close. The next day, he changed his mind and said the schools should close. He did that, I think, because of the evidence from SAGE. We looked at the SAGE minutes. That's where we were getting our position from. And SAGE was saying that if the schools were fully open, that there was no way the R rate that we used to talk about all the time, we've forgotten what it means, but the R rate would be above 1. The virus would be exponentially growing. Now, it wasn't, and this is difficult to say, it wasn't that children were particularly at risk. By January 21, we knew that the risks went up with age and with, if you had diabetes, you were at risk, etc. So SAGE was saying the schools had to be closed to protect other people, to protect the vulnerable parents, the vulnerable grandparents of the children in schools, the vulnerable parents and vulnerable grandparents of the teachers in the schools. And we thought SAGE were right. So we were going with the bulk of scientific thought on the matter.
Molly, how do you feel listening to that? You were all about opening the schools, reopening the schools, and you were looking at the same data and listening to what SAGE were saying. How do you respond to what Kevin's saying?
Look, I mean, I do have considerable sympathy, actually, for that argument, and I do understand that at the time there was a real perception that adults, perhaps all of them, perhaps a subset, were in real danger. I think there are a few things I'd say to that. I think it seems that the risk from COVID, many of us might accept now that was rather overinflated. I don't blame the teaching unions for that. I've put the blame of that squarely at the door of government. I think at the same time, the harms of school closures were either downplayed or perhaps not taken into account in the way they could have been. So you talk a lot about the SAGE papers and the R rate, and we heard so much about that, all those charts, this very deliberate, propagandized fear environment that we all were asked to live under. We never heard really the equivalent about the other side of the equation, the harms to children. And I don't just mean learning loss. I mean, what happens to children when you shut down childhood? Often asking them to be in environments which we sadly now know are unsafe. What happens to children when you put them in front of screens, when you move their whole lives to phones? And I think had we maybe balanced that, we may have come to a different conclusion.
Kevin, listening to that, and how do you feel now? I'm in a kind of reflective mood this evening, and looking back across all of the years, what do you feel about what you must have seen has been distilled about long-term, possibly permanent harm caused to the youngest?
I mean, I've got two reactions to what Molly's just said. First, to question Molly about whether she really thinks that COVID wasn't a risk. I mean, do you mean now that we've got the vaccination, it's not a risk? Because we had 2 colleagues in my work who died of COVID before vaccination. They died of it, and they were not of an advanced stage, but they did have other conditions, and they died of it. It is a serious illness. But I absolutely agree that closing schools does have huge consequences, and they're not good consequences. And, and it's... if you're a disadvantaged child, the consequences are worse. I mean, if you're at home and you've got a nice private garden and you've got your own bedroom and you've got your own iPad, then that's very different to being in a 5th floor flat and no space whatsoever. I think the consequences have been bad for children, and our government should have been doing more to make sure the school closures should be as short as possible. Our school closures were longer than many other countries. During the pandemic, I spoke to my opposite number in the Danish teacher union. They had some school closures, but they were shorter. But the reason they were shorter, we talked this through for some time with my colleague Mary Bousted, our colleague. Their class sizes were smaller, their space standards were better, they had better ventilation in their classrooms, so it was more possible to have the school open without the virus spreading. But we were looking at the ONS statistics, which showed that when the schools were open, the level of COVID amongst the children was going up week by week by week. When the schools closed, it started to fall again. This is the hard thing. It wasn't to protect the children. It was to protect their parents, their vulnerable brother and sister, their vulnerable grandparents, you know, and we now owe it to those kids. The government should have been investing far more in recovery, and that's not just education recovery, it's social recovery for those children.
So, look, I mean, I absolutely agree with you on the last point. I think in terms of your question about, you know, how dangerous the virus was, I would say the sad and probably quite uncomfortable reality here is that for the vast majority of healthy people, it was not a serious threat. That is not to say there are not many adults for whom it was a very serious threat. But what we did is we asked healthy young people, including children, all of them, to bear a burden that I would say was never theirs to bear. We asked them to overcompensate for the ill health of the adult population, and I think that morally is wrong.
Kevin, is there regret? Is there regret in the industry? And I would always have preferred to think of teaching as amongst those professions that's a calling as well, that there's a pastoral care that you would expect from the people who go into that profession. And do you get any sense of there being a commitment that if something similar happens again, that the teachers and the teachers' unions would stand up to make sure that the mistakes made in the past are not repeated? Or not?
I mean, there's all sorts of things that I regret about that period, but I regret that we couldn't get the government to listen to us. There were times when we were advocating we thought that when it came to a choice, do you open pubs or schools? They opened pubs. They did Eat Out to Help Out. They kept on schools being... It wasn't at that precise time, but if there's a choice, then I'd be in favour of schools being open, other things being closed to keep the R rate below 1. We were trying to get the government to invest in an education plan B during the pandemic, to have more spaces with children and adults with them, safe-checked adults, so you could have more spaces open. The R rate would be a bit lower. We were advocating, for example, there were a number of sixth form colleges that managed to make a very effective, not perfect by any means, but children were in 1 week, at home the next. And half the class was in, half the class was at home. Half of them were learning online, half of them were in. And by doing that situation, they managed to... Their R rate didn't go up, in that their rate of COVID growth seemed to be lower in their institutions. I think we need to look at all those mechanisms, because no teacher would want schools to be closed. You want to find the ways around it.
I feel, I mean, I'm going to run out of time, but I just feel that we're looking back on a national tragedy, a national scandal and a national disgrace, that children, the youngest, everything should be done to protect them, and yet they were made to bear the brunt of the hurt. They took the biggest hit, and I think as a society we should look back on that and find that inexcusable. But I've run out of time on that. I've run out of time on the show. Thank you to all my guests this evening. A fair and open debate, I think you would agree. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. If you're watching on television, stay tuned for Free Speech Nation. That's next. But you can catch up with more of this show online now, featuring more on the ongoing impact of COVID restrictions with my coming up guests, Bev Turner, Nigel Nelson and Dr. Ralph Schulhammer.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast on the Met Office. Well, for the week ahead, it is remaining changeable across the country, but for the most part, it's going to be fairly mild. So as we end this weekend, still got low pressure in charge. This weather front here will bring another spell of rain as we go through the course of the night. Ahead of it, it does turn largely dry and clear, especially across parts of England and Wales. Some mist and fog forming in a few spots. And then behind it, it does then turn a bit drier and clearer for the end of the night across Northern Ireland. But for all of us, it is going to be a mild night. Temperatures not falling much lower than around 5 to 7 degrees. So we do start the day off with some sunshine across eastern parts of the Midlands, East Anglia, Lincolnshire way, but the cloud further west will spread its way that little bit further eastwards. Any rain on it will slowly peter out, so not actually a lot of rain arriving into East Anglia. And then behind it, it does turn drier and brighter, some good spells of sunshine developing before then the next band of rain arrives in the west. Mild, temperatures potentially reaching 17 degrees in the southeast. Tuesday, a rather grey and damp start, plenty of spots of rain around. As the day goes on, we will see some bright spells across parts of Northern Ireland, Scotland, maybe Northern England too, and still remaining fairly mild. Wednesday, Thursday stays fairly changeable, quite wet potentially on Wednesday, but all the time temperatures for all of us in double figures.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
We've got cash, treats and a spring shopping spree to be won in a great British giveaway. You could win an amazing £12,345 in tax-free cash. Plus there's a further £500 of shopping vouchers to spend at your favourite store. We'll also give you a gadget package to use in your garden this spring. That includes a games console, a pizza oven and a portable smart speaker, so you can listen to GB News on the go. For another chance to win the vouchers, the treats and £12,345 in tax-free cash, text GBWIN to 84902. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB03 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on Friday the 29th of March. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if watching or listening on demand. Good luck.
I'm Martin Daubney. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. 2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other. Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 to 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Very good evening to you. It's 7 o'clock. I'm Aaron Armstrong in the GB newsroom. Thousands of Russians have been protesting against Vladimir Putin on the final day of a presidential election he is certain to win. Long queues formed at polling stations across the country at midday in response to a call from the widow of the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, for a noon against Putin protest. Yulia Navalnaya herself attended a demonstration outside the Russian embassy in Berlin, and similar gatherings took place in cities around the world, including London. Protesters in Russia were advised not to carry banners or shout slogans for fear of detention, although at least 74 arrests have been made. Putin has no credible election rivals. Any serious opposition figures are in exile, in prison, or are dead, and perhaps unsurprisingly, exit polls show Putin winning a huge majority. Transport Secretary Mark Harper says Rishi Sunak will lead the Tories into the next election. Senior figures in the Conservatives have been attempting to downplay claims of a plot to replace the Prime Minister with Penny Mordaunt. The move would mean a fourth leader of the party in just 5 years. Well, Mr Harper says, unlike Labour, the Conservatives do have a plan to deliver for the country.
We've got to show them, by the time of the election, two things. We've got to show them that we've got a plan, the plan is working and it's delivering for them. And I think we can see that it is on inflation and on taxes. We've also then got to show them that the Labour Party doesn't have a plan and will be a big risk. You know, for example, we know the Labour Party wants to spend £28 billion on their green plan. They've hidden the price tag now, but they don't know how to pay for it. That would mean taxes going up.
Drivers have been dealing with more disruption on the third day of the M25 closure amid reports of lengthy tailbacks. A 5-mile stretch between junctions 10 and 11 in Surrey has been closed since Friday night, so a bridge could be demolished. The National Highways say the planned gantry was installed overnight and work is on schedule to reopen for Monday rush hour at 6 a.m. Steve Harley, best known as the frontman of the British rock band Cockney Rebel, has died at the age of 73.
Come up and see me to make me smile.
Well, that was their big hit back in 1975. A #1 hit, Make Me Smile. Steve Harley had continued touring until recently.